Alright, let's check the global tire fire. Today, we're not just warming our hands on the blaze, we're conducting a full forensic investigation. We're digging deep into the ashes to find the origin story of the man who arguably threw one of the biggest gas cans on the fire of the 21st century, Vladimir Putin. For most people, he just sort of appeared. One day, post-Soviet Russia was the land of Gorbachev, bad 90s fashion, and a chaotic lurch towards something resembling democracy. The next, it was the land of Putin, full stop. The transition felt abrupt, like a season finale where they kill off the main character and replace him with a quiet, intense guy nobody recognizes from the pilot. But he didn't just materialize in the Kremlin, fully formed, with a steely gaze and a black belt. His rise to power wasn't an accident. It was a masterclass in navigating chaos, leveraging loyalty, and deploying a level of ruthlessness that would make a Machiavellian prince take notes. This is the story of how a mid-level KGB spook, a man once described as an unremarkable gray moth, clawed his way to the top of one of the world's most treacherous political systems to become an absolute ruler. So grab a drink, maybe make it a double, because this is the unnerving and frankly terrifying story of how Vladimir Putin happened. Our story begins in the early 1990s, not in the gilded halls of the Kremlin, but in the gritty, damp streets of St. Petersburg. The Soviet Union had just spectacularly face-planted, and Russia was a chaotic free-for-all. Imagine the fall of Rome, but with more tracksuits and a brutalist concrete aesthetic. It was a time of shock therapy economics, which mostly meant it was shocking how quickly a few people could get obscenely rich while everyone else's life savings turned into toilet paper. Into this mess steps our man, Vladimir Putin. He's fresh from a deeply underwhelming KGB career in Dresden, East Germany. He wasn't some master spy. His main job was running a friendship house and watching helplessly as the Berlin Wall came down, an event that clearly left a mark. He even burned a mountain of KGB files as a mob gathered outside. A fitting start for a man whose career would involve making a lot of inconvenient history disappear. He lands back in his hometown and gets a lifeline from his old law professor, Anatoly Sobchak, who is now the city's first democratically elected mayor. Putin becomes his advisor, and then climbs the ladder to become deputy mayor and chairman of the Committee for Foreign Economic Relations. That sounds incredibly boring, but in 90s Russia, that title meant you were the dragon guarding the treasure. His unofficial job? Deciding who got rich and who got crushed. One of his signature projects was a food for resources program. The idea was simple. St. Petersburg would export raw materials. We're talking oil, timber, rare earth metals, you name it. And in return, foreign companies would send food to feed the starving city. A noble humanitarian cause. Except, according to a city council investigation led by a fiercely determined politician named Marina Salye, it was a complete sham. Salye's commission found that Putin signed off on deals sending hundreds of millions of dollars worth of resources out of the country. The resources left, all right. But the food? It mostly never arrived. The money just vanished into a web of shell companies and offshore accounts. Salye's official report was damning. It concluded that Putin was, at best, catastrophically incompetent and, at worst, massively corrupt. It explicitly recommended he be fired. He wasn't. Sobchak buried the report. Then there was the 20th Trust Construction Company. A federal investigator from Moscow, Andrei Zhikov, started digging into its finances. He alleged that city funds meant for infrastructure projects were being systematically siphoned off. And where did some of that money go? Zhikov traced it to, among other things, luxury villas being built for Putin and his close associates in Spain. Again, Zhikov believed both Putin and Sobchak should be in jail. And again, the investigation was stonewalled and went nowhere. This was Putin's real education. He learned that in the new Russia, laws were suggestions and loyalty was currency. His most critical test came when his mentor, Sobchak, finally lost the mayoral election in 1996 and immediately faced his own corruption investigation. With the walls closing in, Putin didn't run. He proved his worth. He allegedly orchestrated Sobchak's dramatic escape from the country, chartering a private plane to whisk him away to Paris after a very convenient and likely fictitious heart attack. This single act was more than just helping a friend. It was a signal, a flashing neon sign to the real power players in Russia. It said, "I am the guy who cleans up messes. I am the guy who protects his own. I am loyal. And in Moscow, the crumbling, paranoid court of Boris Yeltsin was paying very close attention. By the late 90s, the Kremlin was less a seat of government and more a political hospice. President Boris Yeltsin, a man whose legacy is a cocktail of historic bravery and staggering alcoholism, was a wreck. His health was failing, and his inner circle, a cabal of oligarchs and family members known simply as the family, was panicking. This group, which included his influential daughter Tatiana and the fantastically wealthy oligarch Boris Berezovsky, had profited immensely from Yeltsin's reign. Now they were terrified that as soon as Yeltsin was gone, a new leader would come in, and the first thing they'd do is launch a wave of corruption investigations that would land them all in prison. They needed an exit strategy. They needed a successor who wouldn't just be a placeholder, but a guarantor. A human shield. Their search for this person was almost comical. Yeltsin went through prime ministers like he went through bottles of vodka. There was a parade of them, each auditioning for the role of heir apparent, and each failing the loyalty test. Then in August 1999, Yeltsin made his final fateful choice. He fired his latest prime minister and appointed a man nobody in the general public had ever heard of, the quiet, steely-eyed director of the FSB, the successor agency to the KGB. Vladimir Putin. To the Russian people, he was a ghost. A poll that month gave him a public approval rating of just 2%. He was uncharismatic, spoke in a monotone, and looked deeply uncomfortable in the spotlight. He was the ultimate bureaucrat, the gray moth. But the family wasn't looking for a rock star. They were looking for a hitman. They had seen his work in St. Petersburg. They saw how he took down their enemy, the prosecutor general Yuri Skaratov, who was getting too close to their financial dealings by leaking a compromising video. They saw how he protected Sobchak. They knew he understood the rules of the game. They called their plan Operation Successor. The goal was to install Putin, use the full power of the state to build his image, and ensure a smooth transfer of power that protected them all. But a 2% approval rating is a problem. They needed an event. A crisis. Something that would allow their quiet bureaucrat to transform into a national savior. And as if on cue, they got one. September 1999. A month into Putin's premiership. A series of explosions ripped through apartment buildings in 3 Russian cities, Buynaksk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk. The attacks happen in the dead of night. Concrete buildings crumble into dust. Over 300 innocent men, women, and children are killed in their beds. It was a national trauma, a visceral, terrifying event that made every single Russian feel unsafe. It was, in effect, Russia's 9/11. Before the rubble had even stopped smoking, the new, unknown prime minister was on every television screen. And he wasn't the quiet bureaucrat anymore. He was pure, cold fury. He unequivocally blamed Chechen terrorists and, in a line that would define his persona, promised to hunt them down everywhere, snarling, "If we catch them in the toilet, we will waste them in the outhouse." For a nation paralyzed by fear, this was exactly what they wanted to hear. He was decisive. He was brutal. He was strong. He immediately launched the Second Chechen War, a savage, scorched earth campaign that was framed by the state-controlled media as a righteous crusade against terror. His approval ratings exploded, from 2% to over 50% in a matter of months. The boring gray moth was reborn as Vladimir the Terrible, the nation's protector. But the official story of the bombings, the one that propelled Putin to power, is riddled with inconsistencies and deeply disturbing questions. The most damning evidence that this was not what it seemed came from the city of Ryazan. On September 22nd, a vigilant resident spotted suspicious individuals planting large sacks in the basement of his apartment building. He called the police. The local bomb squad arrived and tested the contents of the sacks. The result? They contained hexogen, a powerful military-grade high explosive, and the detonator was live. A catastrophe was narrowly averted. The 3 people caught by local police were not Chechen terrorists. They were agents of the FSB, Putin's own agency. The initial story was a disaster for the government. But then, the head of the FSB went on television and delivered one of the most audacious explanations in modern political history. He claimed the entire incident was a training exercise. The sacks, he insisted, were just full of sugar, and the test that found explosives was wrong. A training exercise? in a building full of sleeping civilians, using what looked like a real bomb that they forgot to tell local law enforcement about. It was and is an insult to human intelligence, too. The aftermath is even more chilling. Any attempt to independently investigate the bombings was systematically crushed. 2 deputies on an investigative commission, Sergei Yushchenkov and Yuri Shchekochikin, were assassinated. Journalist Anna Politkovskaya, a fierce critic of the Chechen War, was shot and killed in her apartment building. Former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko, who publicly accused the agency of orchestrating the bombings, was poisoned with radioactive polonium-210 in London. The official evidence was sealed. The case was closed. We may never have a courtroom confession, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. The bombings created a crisis that only a strongman could solve, and that strongman just happened to be the former head of the agency caught planting one of the bombs. It was the ultimate political magic trick. The stage was now perfectly set. The crisis had been manufactured. The hero had been forged in the fires of war and television propaganda. All that was left was the final act of the play. It came on December 31st, 1999. As the rest of the world was popping champagne for the new millennium, Boris Yeltsin gave a shocking pre-recorded address to the Russian nation. Looking frail and emotional, he announced he was resigning. Effective immediately, the new acting president of the Russian Federation was Vladimir Putin. Putin's very first act as president, his decree number 1, wasn't about the economy, social security, or the war. It was a decree granting Boris Yeltsin and his family complete lifetime immunity from any and all future corruption prosecutions. Operation Successor was complete. The bargain was sealed. The keys to the kingdom had been handed over in exchange for a get-out-of-jail-free card. A snap presidential election was called for March 2000, 3 months earlier than scheduled. The political opposition was in total disarray, given no time to organize or campaign. Putin, meanwhile, had the entire apparatus of the state behind him. He was portrayed not as a candidate, but as the de facto leader, the wartime president, the only man who could hold Russia together. He won predictably with 53% of the vote. The gray moth from St. Petersburg, the man who got his start in the murky swamps of post-Soviet graft, the loyal enforcer who proved his worth by protecting his patrons and, allegedly, terrorizing his own people, was now the undisputed leader of Russia. He didn't take power in a violent coup. He was handed it, gift-wrapped. He was the solution to a problem that his own organization appears to have created. He promised to restore order and stability after the chaos of the 90s, and in a way he did. But it was his order. An order built on absolute loyalty, enforced by the ever-present threat of the security services, and funded by a system of institutionalized corruption that he didn't invent, but which he would go on to perfect and export. He was the accidental Czar, who rode to power on the back of a national tragedy, and has refused to let go ever since. And that's the way the world burns. Stay snarky.